Welcome to the Phoenix Effect podcast with Elle, Kristen, and Dennis. We are three narrative-trained therapists, and we will be interviewing storytellers from all walks of life. We will explore what people do to find belonging, purpose, and success. Listen in as we delve into the depths of the human experience. If you have a story you would like to tell, stay tuned to find out how to become a part of the show. Are you ready for a good story? Here we go. Hey listeners, Elle here. In this podcast, Kristen, Dennis, and I sit down to talk about this idea I had heard on the interweb that the root of all suffering is not belonging. However, before we actually got to discussing that subject, Kristen and Dennis and I were just checking in and chatting, and we kind of had this interesting conversation that I wanted you to hear it. If you are an ex-evangelical, or you are deconstructing, or you love someone who is deconstructing, I really wanted you to hear this part of the conversation. So that's where we're going to pick up. I would love to know what you think.
I don't know. Let me ask you this too. In the world of light and darkness, what is that, Kristen? What does that bring up for you if we start talking about light and darkness?
It's a more activating conversation for me to have because I don't believe the things that I used to. And so it's a little bit harder for me to I don't have that same conversation that I used to have maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Yeah, I notice, oh, okay, in this conversation, and it's fine. I'm like, ooh, I'm feeling a little activated. It's feeling a little spicy.
Tell me more about it.
But I think there's a lot of pain and a lot of weaponization that has happened in religious context for me. And so I think I like having these types of conversations, but having them with people who I know believe differently than me, and I respect that difference, but it makes me feel like, ooh, I need to protect myself here, or I am not sure, like my what I believe may not be understood here or respected. So it feels like a marginalized place to sit. And that's not against you two personally, because I know that's not your intention or what would happen with you, but just in these spaces in general, it's what happens.
Right. I think I was sensing that too. And I'm wondering for you if it's a storied memory in your body, like it isn't okay to think or believe something different than the other people in the room. If you think or believe something different, you don't belong.
I think, especially in the context of church, yes, because that is the experience of church, right? If you don't believe our doctrine or our theology, then you don't belong. And yeah, I think that is a really real, even if that's not the conscious thought, that feeling of danger, right? Of like, okay, ooh.
That's a good segue. If you don't mind my going there, I heard on the interwebs something along the lines of the root of all suffering is not belonging. How do you notice that, or have you witnessed that to be true? Because it feels like something was happening in a religious context where that was absolutely true for you.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of truth behind that. If we talk about the things that drive people to therapy offices, it's things related to shame, to loneliness, to that leads to depression, that sort of thing. I think a lot of trauma or abuse is someone saying, I'm rejecting you, I'm othering you, I'm subjecting you to pain because I have power over you, or I think I'm better than you, or whatever that is, which is disconnection from belonging. And I think that's where a lot of human suffering and pain comes from.
Does it feel too personal to share how that impacted you and your religion growing up?
I need a moment to think about it.
Okay, yeah.
You ask the question again.
If the root of all suffering is not belonging, and as if when Dennis and I were talking about something to do with God, your protective parts came up. And I'm wondering if it was related to if I don't align with their same beliefs, I won't belong. And I have to protect myself for not belonging. So I'm going to have to present in a certain way. And I was wondering that was a storied reaction for you, because I'm wondering, growing up, if you didn't believe what the people around you believed, if that impacted how you had to show up in a social setting.
Yeah, I think in this context, I know that I can show up and still belong with you all. Like, you know what I believe and still talk to me. So I think that this is a safe place. The fact that it's recorded and on a podcast is another level of like awareness of who is listening and what is happening, because the internet can be a scary place. But I think my experience growing up in fundamentalism was that the way to belong was just to really give yourself to the faith, right? And so I think that there was, for me, a lack of exploring myself because there wasn't permission to do that. There was only an expectation of the way to show up. And I put everything into showing up in that way. And so I was really, my whole identity revolved around how well can I be the model Christian or live my faith in a way that is so authentic, because this is how I can fit in with people. This is how I belong with God. This is how I belong with others. This is how I'm in with a group. And I think a lot of my faith deconstruction started coming when I realized, like, oh, I actually don't even know myself. Like, I've never even been given permission to explore who I am, because I've always just been told who I needed to be. And so as I started to explore who I was, I started to realize, oh, there's some things about me that don't align with what I've been told is okay. There's beliefs that I have, there's ideas, there's people that I value that the church says is not okay. And so then how do I do with that? If I was created in the image of God and I'm now like trying to be who he created me to be, and it's discordant with the teachings of the church, then do I belong to myself or do I belong to the church? I have to choose.
Is some of those, just trying to reflect back what I heard you say, and it's interesting that because the question was like, the root of all suffering is not belonging. And then it sounded like the first element that you were speaking to, Kristen, is that in order to belong, there has to be suffering. We have to put off all of ourselves, our desires, to get that sense of belonging. You can't have wants, needs, individuality. That's the right word. And then the second aspect of it was also that now, in addition to that, in addition to putting off yourself, you also have to choose people that are just like that. If you have friends that are outside of that network, you need to cut them off also. So I was hearing like two different things that seemed to pose a real dilemma as you started strengthening your own mind and doing some of your own deconstruction, maybe. Are those two of the things?
Yeah, I think the real place of belonging that was at war was with myself, right? Like I wasn't allowed to know who I was. And as I discovered who I was in my late 20s, or I started that path to discovery, then I realized the world around me started shifting really quickly. And the type of belonging is, I was just talking with a friend about this. There's something really bittersweet about my experiences of the church, because there's something, I don't think there's any other place that I've experienced the network of people that surround you, right? Like, of just knowing that you have people in a community, a large community, but there's something very disconnected about that, because who is that community knowing? They're knowing a projection of myself. They're not knowing who I really am. Versus now, I struggle to find community because there's not a big organization that is easy to go visit every week and meet people, right? It's harder as an adult to have friends and make community, especially in the same way as a church. Yet the people that know me like truly know me. And so there's a sense of belonging that is deeper rooted and more meaningful to me than most relationships that I had in growing up in church environments. So the quality of relationship is different. And in a perfect world, like we could have as much community as we need. And I think it's hard to find people who are living in, we've talked about that, I think, on the podcast before. Like it's hard to find people who are living authentically from themselves and want to connect with other people who are living authentically from themselves.
I'd love to hear too more about, I appreciated hearing about your self-discovery that you went through in the 20s and knowing who you are, because I find that to be an area that I'm like, who the hell am I? And I frequently hear that around me being said. I don't even know who I am. So I don't know that we want to talk about that right now. You could feel, I'd love to hear at some point a little bit of what your path looked like there. The other thing I'm curious about is what parts of you, what parts of you, of what you've discovered of yourself, not, I'm not so curious about the parts that might be exiled by the church, but what parts are they missing out on? Like, what are they missing out on of Kristen?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Sorry.
What parts of you, what parts of who you are they missing out on?
Who's they?
Like the church, which
Yeah.
parts did she have to cut out?
Yeah, the marginalized parts, right? Like the parts that in society would be identified as a marginalized population. The church likes the people that look like them. And so if you're not like them, then that's not okay for various reasons. What were you going to say earlier, Elle?
I was just noticing the bind that you were in of if I'm going to find belonging, it's going to be painful connection because I have to sacrifice myself. I can't belong to myself. But if I belong to myself, I connect with myself, I've lost connection with people. Did I understand that right? The bind
Yeah.
that you're in? Okay. Yeah.
And when you throw in the dynamic of connection with God in that too, talk about a power dynamic. It's scary to say, okay, I'm leaving the church and then I'm losing connection with God, who I've always been taught is the one who decides if I go to heaven or hell, or decides if I'm good or bad, or decides if I'm worthy or unworthy. And I'm choosing myself because I will die if I don't. Like I need to be connected to myself because otherwise I'm lost. Anyway, this doesn't have to be about me. Somebody else can be on the hot seat now.
Yeah, so actually I really like it. And I appreciate that we can spend some time with you, Kristen, because like part of my question there was like, there's a whole bunch of groups that are really missing out. If you are going to be cut out because of certain parts of you that aren't congruent with whatever their agenda is, like they're also missing out on these amazing parts of you that we've experienced. So I almost feel like that's the bind for them, but let's stay in this bind for you. I really appreciate what you just drew out there, Elle. And I have a feeling like so many of us, like we're in a similar situation. We're all in a very similar situation. So this bind is applicable to all of us. And I'm just wrestling right now with how is that bind, how can that bind be loosened? What is the path to loosening that bind?
I don't know. I can say that as I've walked this path of discovering myself, it's realizing that I do have control, like control as much of it as any of us have control over my life. Like I can decide who I want to be around or not be around. Like I can decide what's good for me or what's not good for me. I don't have to make those decisions based on what people outside of me think, whether that's God or people in authority. Like I have some autonomy in my life. Like I can decide what is good for me. And changing that locus of control from something that's outside to something that's inside to say I can be guided by the good person that God created me to be, right? There's like my flesh, I've thrown off the idea that my flesh is sinful. Sure, I make mistakes, but I think I'm a pretty good person. Like I mess up. Sure, everybody does, but I'm allowed to believe that I'm a good person and that I'm not like evil at my core, right? And trying to fix that, like trying to spend my whole life trying to fix that. Like I can just be good because God created me as a human, right? And if I'm good, then I can trust myself. And if I can trust myself, then I can make decisions. And if I can make decisions, then I can choose good things for my life. And that is viewed as a type of hyper independence in church situations that is sinful, or you are just leaning on the flesh, or you only have your own wicked desires. The flesh is wicked, or the heart is wicked. Who can know it, type of thing. And I'm like, I don't know. My life has gotten a lot better once I started making decisions for myself and not for other people.
What were you going to say, Dennis? You were leaning forward before.
Just process. I'm just process like everything Kristen just said. Like I really deeply connect with. I feel like that the hair on my arms go up because like when so Kelly and I like came to Seattle for this marriage thing to try to strengthen our marriage, and it was a lot of hard work. And we reached out to Kristen and spent the evening with Kristen. She gave up her evening, gave us some awesome spots that we could choose from to have dinner. She connected in with us and gave us all sorts of resources and support for just some challenging parent dynamics that we were involved in. And it was like light. It was like light. It was a breath. I was able to get, both Kelly and I were able to get away from just the hardness of some of the things that we were even like working through for a time to be like revitalized by Kristen, really. And like that's the light that is like meant to be coming from the church, where there's no judgment. She's not like just we were just in each other's presence. You were providing like super positive energy. And I really felt supported and I felt like your care. And it was just a shame, even as I was hearing you voice all of those things that are so prevalent, like in the church, like those, the judgment that's present, the just so far from what I think actually God, who is our Father, like does desire. I think he is saddened when a lot of those experiences that you were your experiences that are tons of other people's experiences become intertwined with the message of like faith. It's no wonder people are drawn away from it and don't want part of that. We are good people, like, and I am at war. I still feel like that war in me from my early Catholic days where I actually felt like I was bad. That was the message I heard. And so unbinding myself from that and then trying to find other people that are going to think like me and be accepting of me and who I am is hard. That is hard because I'm unbinding two areas. I've got to unbind my own things that I put on myself. And then I have to find other people that aren't going to be trying to put shackles on me again. And that's difficult.
Happening for you, Elle?
Dennis is naming that feeling of badness was there pretty early. I totally identify with that one too. And I was reflecting, I think just yesterday, probably, that feeling of badness was there so young, like as early as we can go. I think I had this understanding that I was like a bad baby, right? So now I'm a bad baby and I have to figure out how can I show up perfectly to get connection. And so I find myself in this bind of I have someone say, I like you because you're authentic. Until I say something they don't like, and I'm showing up authentically. Now they don't like the authenticity quite so much. And so then I find myself trying to pivot with how can I show up more perfectly so I can stay in connection with you? But then I just lost the authenticity that someone named as what they liked in the first place. So it's just this constant dance of, wait, how can I be with you, but be myself too?
Yeah. How do I make myself palatable to people and yet still hold the truth of who I am? Is that possible?
And I'd like to further develop, like you learned at a young age, and it's become, it works. If you show up perfectly, you're in connection. Like it works for you. It worked to get connection as
It
long as
did.
you're doing it, as long as you're doing it how
Right.
they want it
Yes.
and
Right.
knowing what they're looking for, which you're really good at.
Mm.
But the moment you try to just be yourself,
It's like
it,
rude or offensive to people.
So then is
yeah.
that really connection?
What was it? What were we doing? What is that called? Is there a word for that? Plain pretend?
The generic version. I don't know.
Do you have experiences where you feel, either one of you, that you've shown up authentically and that was fine with people?
I think I've had experiences on both sides with the same people. I think it's people have limits for what they're able to hold for others, um, based on what they're holding for themselves too. Like that's what makes this really hard, right? In a perfect world, it's really easy. Like we all just show up authentically and then we all get along because we all want everyone to be authentic. But we all have wounds too. And those imperfect ways that we show up for others can hit on those wounds and it can perpetuate harm and it can feel harmful even if it's not, and it gets really messy really fast.
Showing up authentically sounds so beautiful and freeing. But when we experience other people's authenticity, I know we all don't always like it. If my sons are showing up as their true authentic selves, I found out this week they're not going to put the toilet seat down. That bothers me. I don't like it. So I start to protest other people's freedom.
I think what I noticed at some point was me realizing I would be upset with somebody else for not presenting a certain way when I would be working really hard to show up and present that way for them. So it's that feeling of it's not fair. Like I'm doing all this work to show up the right way, quote unquote, for them. Why aren't they doing the same thing for me? And it was irritating, and there was a jealousy there of
Yeah.
like, why does it get to be so easy for them that they don't care about that when my life is so consumed by caring about how I'm being perceived, how people are thinking about me, wanting to make sure that I'm showing up in the right way so that I'm not upsetting anybody or offending anybody. And as I've moved more into, I'm just going to be me, and that's going to catch the right people and it's going to let the right people go. I do offend people a lot more. Like I am apologizing a lot more often. I am upsetting people a lot more frequently. And I also have a much lighter mental load because I just care a lot less. I care about what people think, right? Like I care about being in connection, but I just care less. Like I care about me more. Like I'm the first priority. And then it works out in a weird way where I seem to have more space for other people's imperfections and whatever because I'm more accepting of mine as well.
It's frustrating when there's no clear line of showing up authentically, accepting people's differences or their quirks, and drawing limits on you just can't treat people that way. And so I'm wondering if we're often going back and forth between the two of, okay, I'm going to stay in connection with you, and that doesn't feel good because you're hurting me, towards, I'm just going to accept you as you are. Like, do you know what I mean with that flow? Yeah. It's frustrating, I think, that we don't know clearly, like, this is what you can do in a relationship and this is what you can't.
Or we're taught this is what you should do in a relationship and this is what you can't. And when the relationship doesn't fit into that, really, like relationships are more nuanced than that. So when there's these, yeah, but there's this, but then there's also this, or this person is doing this, but then I understand because this is happening for them, or whatever it might be. I feel like it blows the rule out of the water. And it's then I don't know how to navigate this now because this doesn't fit into the neat, tidy box that I was taught that this is how relationships should work. A plus B equals C. And we're over here doing calculus. And I'm like, huh, I don't know. I'm getting lost in the middle of it because what's actually happening here? What are we trying to figure out?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious for you, Kristen or Elle, like what has been your experience on what is most likely to bring about a rupture that you guys are kind of talking about?
Displays of strong emotion, even if they're not directed at the person. That's been my experience.
For me, it's because I say something that people don't like. What about you, Dennis?
I would say this, that the deeper the conversation is, the more likely those things that you both mentioned are likely to come up. And I know I'm on several soccer teams, and after the soccer game, everybody gets together, hangs out, golfing with people a decent amount. I'm around guys a lot, and I just think most of the convos that I'm having with them are not likely to bring about any type of a rupture for the most part, just because I think it's less risky. It's less risky conversation. So it tells me that you guys are like in deeper conversations. Like the most potential for rupture producing is in my closest, most intimate relationship with it, which is with my wife, where we've thankfully been learning a lot more on how to repair because we both do love each other, but we both say things that unintentionally harm each other or sometimes intentionally harm each other. And I know we put a lot of work into how to do that. And I'm just thinking, gosh, with the friends, then it's probably so likely that if there's a rupture and the other person is not willing to put in that deep work, it's going to result in a less likely that there is going to be repair or that people are just going to want to move past it. Where
Yeah,
can you give me a specific, Al, like where you were speaking very general? Can you give me any specifics?
I can. I don't know if I should on the podcast.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to think about that. I do. When you were talking though, it reminded me of something Shane Burkle, who we had on the podcast early on, says one of the most important qualities in a couple is their ability to give and receive feedback. And I think that can be true for any relationship.
I think there's a paradox that the more you know someone, the more safe and comfortable you feel with them, the more your guards are let down, the more we'll have these instances where rupture is likely to happen, right? Because you're showing the undesirable parts, the parts that you've learned people don't like, and you start to let those parts of you show because it feels safe and it feels comfortable and it feels accepting. And then you have this moment of, okay, you saw the real me. What's it going to be? How are we going to handle this? And either the cycle repeats and it plays into the story that you know so well, or sometimes you have a chance where it goes a different way.
Hey, listeners, Elle here. I just wanted to take a brief pause in the podcast and highlight that there is a lot of nuance happening in this conversation. At the beginning of the podcast, we were listening to Kristen speak to the lack of belonging she felt when her beliefs about God changed with the Christian community. And we're getting ready to listen to a story from Dennis, how someone's behavior could have caused them to be pushed out of a soccer group. And instead, he was welcomed back in. And I just wanted to highlight there is so much nuance to how we move in and out of belonging.
I want to throw out here was an interesting example. We were playing in a soccer tournament 3 weeks ago, and there's one of the dudes on our team who is pretty headed. He can lose control. He fouled somebody in the box. He didn't think he fouled him in the box. The other team got awarded a penalty kick. This ensued a argument between him and the ref. Ultimately, he picked up the ball and punched the ball across the field and then got a red card, got ejected from the game, which puts us in a position where we're working off of 10 players. And it was interesting because I noticed like the guys initially were like supportive of him. And then after the game, and he's gone, are frustrated with him. And then talking about, do we want to, almost what we're talking about right here, where I could hear some of the comments would actually be to cut him out of the team. And then the next time I got together with him, I just checked in with him and I talked to him about that event. And again, like he was coming through with all of the feelings that were going on for him, what was happening for him, explaining why he did what he did. And I said, look, all of that's true. And like that actually really served you well, but it didn't really serve us very well. Like, we actually then had to pay the cost of that as a team. Is there anything you can think of where you can still feel okay, but it doesn't cost the team significantly? So that's really, we want to be fair to all of us. I want you to feel like have something you can do. So anyway, it actually caused some deeper thought. And then he apologized to the guys. And I've noticed now, like, he seems to be playing with a little bit more, where he's caring about the team a bit more. And so I think it just takes somebody to do it, though. Like, somebody actually has to do it. And in this case, I did do it, but I'm also like, who would do it for me? Would somebody do that for me? Or would I just be the one that gets cut out of the team? And I think that's what we're talking about. How do we find ourselves in a relationship with people that are actually going to do? That was a hard conversation for me to have. It's a big dude. He's pretty like volatile, a little hot-headed. I didn't want to have it, but I cared about him. And like, how do I find those people that are going to care about me in that same way, that are going to be willing to have those difficult conversations, like just without cutting me off?
I'll say, I think I remember when we were in NFTC together and we'd be engaging a story and the invitation to name the really hard thing. And everyone's dancing around, oh, I don't know if we really want to talk about that. Like, the person who's bringing the story isn't saying that explicitly. I don't know that I want to name the thing that they're not naming, because it feels really hard to name something for someone that they're not able to name for themselves. And yet the experience as a storyteller to say, no, I brought this story because I want you to name it for me. Like, I need help to name this. And I think that skill of, we're taught so much about being polite and not saying things that could be hard for someone. And I think we actually need a lot more of that in our society, not a lot less, because that's what we're longing for from each other. That's what we need from each other. And yet it's so hard to give.
And that's where we end today. We are so glad you joined us. We want to invite you to get involved in the show. First, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. That way, you don't miss out on a future episode. If you are super curious, you can also find us on YouTube. Second, if you'd like to learn more about joining us and sharing your story, send us an email at phoenixeffectpodcast@gmail.com. That's phoenixeffectpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This podcast and website represents the opinions of Elizabeth Key, Kristen Boskel-John, and Dennis Roberts, and their guests to the show and website. The content here should not be taken as medical or psychological advice. This content is for informational purposes only, and because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast and website are our own and do not represent that of our places of work. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or website. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a therapist-client relationship.